April 1994, Rwanda was drowning in fear. Across the country, families ran through darkness with nowhere to hide. The roads were dangerous, villages were burning, neighbors were turning against neighbors, and thousands of terrified people ran to the one place they believed evil would never enter: the church. Mothers carried babies on their backs. Fathers held trembling children close to their chests. Old men and women prayed softly under their breath. Inside the churches, people cried, sang hymns, and begged God for protection. For generations, churches have been places of peace, places of refuge, places where human beings believed they would be safe. But in Rwanda, even the churches became killing grounds. Doors were broken open. The prayers were drowned by screams. Families died together on church floors. Some mothers covered their children with their own bodies. Some children survived by hiding beneath the dead. When the violence finally ended, churches across Rwanda had become mass graves. Today, many of those churches still stand in silence, not only as places of worship, but as witnesses to one of the darkest crimes in human history. The genocide didn't begin with machetes. It began with words. Every day across Rwanda, people gathered around small radio sets, in homes, in shops, in village centers. Radio was powerful. People trusted it. People listened carefully. But in 1994, some of the voices on the radio were spreading something deadly: hatred. The broadcasters mocked the Tutsi people. They called them enemies. They called them traitors. Then the language became darker. They called human beings cockroaches. Again and again, listeners were told that killing was necessary, that violence was patriotic, that their neighbors were dangerous. The radio gave names, it gave addresses, it told militias where people were hiding. And slowly, fear turned into fury. Ordinary people began to believe extraordinary lies. Friends turned against friends. Neighbors hunted neighbors. Teachers betrayed students. And in some cases, even family members betrayed one another. The radio did not pull the trigger, but it helped prepare the minds of those who did. In Rwanda, the airwaves became weapons, and once the killing began, the voices on the radio kept calling for more blood. In 1994, Rwanda became a nightmare for children. Some were too young to understand what was happening. They only knew that people were screaming and running. Many children watched armed men enter their homes. They watched their parents beaten or killed before their eyes. Some never saw their families again. One survivor later remembered hiding beneath dead bodies for 2 days. She was only a child. She could hear footsteps around her. She could hear voices outside. She could hear people crying for help. But she did not move, because moving meant dying. Across Rwanda, thousands of children hid in swamps, forests, ceilings, churches, and mass graves. Some survived without food or water for days. Some survived by pretending to be dead. And when the killing finally stopped, Many children were left completely alone. No parents, no homes, no answers. Some became orphans overnight. Some lost every member of their family. Many survivors say the hardest memories are not the screams, but the silence that came after. The silence of empty homes, empty classrooms, empty arms. For Rwanda's children, the genocide did not end after 100 days. For many of them, it never truly ended. Rwanda is one of the smallest countries in Africa, but it's also one of the most beautiful. Rolling green hills stretch across the land like waves. Mist hangs gently over the valleys in the early morning. Farmers walk quietly on steep hillsides. Children run along red dirt roads. People often call Rwanda the land of 1,000 hills. For centuries, families lived here side by side. They shared the same language, the same culture, the same songs, the same God. Neighbors attended weddings together. Children played together. Communities grew together. From the outside, Rwanda looked peaceful. But beneath the beauty of the hills, old tensions were growing. Years of division, fear, and political manipulation were slowly poisoning the country. Many people did not yet realize how dangerous the situation had become. But history was moving quietly in the background. And soon, the 1,000 hills of Rwanda will witness one of the darkest tragedies the modern world has ever seen. To understand Rwanda genocide, we must first understand two names that shaped the country's history: Hutu and Tutsi. For a long time, these groups were not completely separate ethnic races as many people later believed. They spoke the same language. They lived in the same community. They shared the same religion and culture. In many cases, people married across the groups. Families lived side by side for generations. Originally, the difference was connected more to social class and wealth. The Tutsi were often cattle owners and were generally wealthier. The Hutu were mostly farmers. But a person could sometimes move from one group to another through marriage, wealth, or status. Then colonial rule changed everything. When European powers arrived in Rwanda, they began by dividing people more strictly. The Belgian colonial government believed the Tutsi looked more European. Because of this racist thinking, they gave many Tutsi people better education, government positions, and political power. The Hutu majority became increasingly resentful. Then identity cards were introduced. For the first time, every person was officially labeled Hutu or Tutsi. A social difference slowly became a dangerous political identity. Over time, bitterness grew, fear grew, anger grew, and decades later, some divisions would explode into unimaginable violence. Long before the genocide began, Rwanda was already carrying deep wounds. Many of those wounds were made worse during the colonial period. In the late 19th century, European powers arrived in Africa and took control of many territories. Rwanda first came under German rule. Later, After the First World War, Belgium took control. The colonial authorities did not simply govern Rwanda, they reshaped its society. The Belgians believed the Tutsi people were naturally superior to the Hutu majority. This belief was based on racist colonial ideas, not science or truth. Because of this, many Tutsi were given positions of power. They received better education, better jobs, more political influence. Meanwhile, many Hutu people felt pushed aside in their own country. Resentment slowly began to grow. Then the colonial government introduced identity cards. Every Rwandan was officially labeled either Hutu or Tutsi. What had once been more flexible social groups became rigid ethnic divisions. The cards followed people everywhere, into schools, into workplaces, into government offices. And decades later, those same identity cards would become instruments of death at roadblocks during the genocide. Colonial rules planted dangerous seeds, divisions, inequality, suspicion. And although the colonial powers eventually left Rwanda, the tensions they deepened did not live with them. By the late 1950s, anger in Rwanda had reached a breaking point. For many years, the Hutu majority had lived under a system where the Tutsi minority held much of the political power. Now, the balance was beginning to change. As Rwanda moved towards independence, violence erupted across the country. In 1959, attacks against Tutsi communities began spreading. Homes were burned, families killed, thousands fled in fear. Many Tutsi escaped to neighboring countries like Uganda, Burundi, Tanzania, and Congo. Some believed they would return home after a short time, but many remained refugees for decades. In 1962, Rwanda became independent. Political power shifted to Hutu leaders. But independence did not bring peace. Instead, fear and revenge continued to shape the country. Some exiled Tutsi groups launched attacks from outside Rwanda, hoping to return by force. In response, the government carried out violent reprisals against Tutsi civilians inside the country. Each attack created new fear. Each revenge killing created new anger. And with every cycle of violence, mistrust between communities grew deeper. Children grew up hearing stories of hatred and fear. Politicians used old wounds to gain support. Over time, many Rwandans stopped seeing each other simply as neighbors. They began seeing each other as enemies. By the early 1990s, Rwanda was already standing on dangerous ground. It would not take much for a country to fall into catastrophe. By the early 1990s, Rwanda was no longer just a country with tensions. It had become a country at war with itself. In 1990, a rebel force entered Rwanda from the north. They were the Rwanda Patriotic Front, made up largely of Tutsi refugees who had lived in exile for years. They demanded the right to return home, and they demanded political change. The government of Rwanda saw themselves differently. To the leadership, this was not just a rebellion. It was a threat to the entire state. War broke out. Fighting spread across the northern region of the country. Villages were caught between government soldiers and rebel forces. Families fled their homes again and again. Fear became part of daily life. At the same time, something else was growing inside the government: suspicion. Fear that the rebellion was not just military, but part of a plan to take back the country completely. This fear did not remain contained to the battlefield. It spread into politics, into the media, into everyday conversations. And slowly, a dangerous idea began to form in the minds of extremists: that the enemy was not only the rebels, but the entire Tutsi population. As the civil war continued, the ground beneath Rwanda became even more stable, and the country moved closer to a breaking point it will never recover from. War does not only happen on the battlefield. In Rwanda, another kind of wars was being fought at the same time: a war for the mind. As the civil war continued, extremist voices began to grow louder inside the country. They used newspapers, they used speeches, and most powerfully, they used radio. They told people that danger was everywhere, that enemies were hiding in plain sight, that truth itself was dangerous. Over time, the language became more extreme. Whole groups of people were no longer spoken about as neighbors. They were described as threats, as traitors, as insects. This was not accidental language. It was deliberate, designed to break down empathy, to make violence feel acceptable, to turn fear into action. And slowly, it worked. People began to believe that ordinary civilians were part of an enemy plan, that killing them would be self-defense, that survival required obedience. At the center of this propaganda system were voices that reached nearly every household. Every radio broadcast carried power, and every message pushed the country one step closer to collapse. When a society starts to accept hatred as truth, violence no longer needs permission. It begins to feel normal. By April 1994, Rwanda was already a country filled with fear, tension, and suspicion. The civil war had weakened trust, propaganda had poisoned minds, and political divisions had hardened into dangerous hatred. But the spark that ignited everything came in a single night. April 6, 1994. A plane carrying Rwanda's president, Juvenal Habyarimana, was returning to Kigali. Inside that plane were not only political leaders, but also hope for a fragile peace process that was already under strain. Then, in the sky above Kigali, the plane was shut down. It crashed, and everyone on board was killed. To this day, who fired the missile remains disputed. But what is certain is what happened next. Within hours of the crash, checkpoints appeared across the city. Lists of names were pulled out. Roadblocks were set up on streets, bridges, and intersections. And people began to be stopped based on identity cards: Hutu, Tutsi. The distinction that had been reinforced for decades suddenly became a matter of life and death. The killing did not begin slowly. It began immediately. Armed groups and militias moved from house to house. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Families who had lived together for years were torn apart overnight. What had been fear became action. What had been propaganda became violence. The plane crash did not create hatred, but it opened the door for everything that had been building underneath Rwanda for years. And once that door was opened, there was no stopping what came next. After the plane crash, Rwanda changed shape almost overnight. What followed was not random violence. It was organized, systematic, and nationwide. Across cities, towns, and villages, orders were given. Roadblocks appeared on every major road. Identity cards were checked carefully. If a card said Tutsi, that person was often taken away immediately. The killings moved fast, house to house, street to street, family to family. In many places, local officials and community leaders played a role in identifying people. People who had lived together for years suddenly became targets. Neighbors turned into hunters, and trust disappeared completely. Weapons were not always guns. In fact, most of the killing was done with simple tools: machetes, clubs, metal rods. Tools meant for farming were turned into instruments of destruction. Hiding did not guarantee safety. People fled into churches, schools, swamps, and forests. But the violence followed them everywhere. In some places, entire communities were destroyed in days. In others, the killing lasted weeks without stopping. There was no single battlefield. The entire country became the battlefield. And in the middle of it all, ordinary life collapsed completely. Markets closed, schools emptied, families stopped communicating across neighborhoods. Fear controlled every movement, and as the days passed, the violence did not slow down, it spread. The genocide in Rwanda did not happen in one place. It happened everywhere. In cities, in villages, in homes, in churches, in schools. It was carried out step by step with frightening organization. First came the roadblocks on streets and highways. Armed groups stopped every passing person. Identity cards were demanded. One question decided everything: Hutu or Tutsi. Those identified as Tutsi were often taken aside immediately. Then came the searches, house to house, room to room. People hiding under beds, in ceilings, in toilets, in gardens were found. Next came the mass gatherings. Some were told to go to schools, stadiums, or churches for protection or security checks. But many of those places became traps. Once people were inside, they were surrounded, and killing began. The weapons were often simple: machetes, clubs, knives, and sometimes guns. But the scale was massive because the system involved ordinary people, local leaders, militias, and in some cases neighbors. Fear, propaganda, and pressure pushed many into participation. Refusing to take part could also mean death. So silence became survival. The violence was not only physical, it was psychological. People were forced to watch what was happening around them, to betray others, or to be betrayed themselves. And as the days turned into weeks, the country itself became unrecognizable. Homes were empty, roads were filled with danger, entire communities disappeared, and the world began to hear fragments of what was happening, but still struggled to fully understand the scale of it. In every genocide, there is a hidden suffering that does not always appear in numbers. For women in Rwanda, the violence carried a particular weight. They were not only targeted as members of a group, they were targeted in ways meant to destroy dignity, families, and future generations. In those 100 days, many women lost husbands, brothers, fathers, and sons. Entire families were taken apart in a matter of hours. Some women fled with children in their backs, moving from place to place, never knowing where safety was. Hiding places were never settled. Forests, swamps, abandoned buildings, all became temporary shelters. Fear followed them everywhere. Many women were forced to witness violence against their loved ones. And even after survival, the trauma did not end. Because survival itself often came with deep emotional and physical scars. In the aftermath, many women were left alone, without homes, without support, and in many cases, without answers. Yet, even in the darkest moments, some women protected others. They hid children. They shared food where there was almost none. They guided strangers through dangerous paths. They carried life forward when everything around them was collapsing. After the violence, women became central to rebuilding Rwanda, raising orphaned children, rebuilding broken communities, and holding together a society that had almost been torn apart completely. But for many survivors, healing did not mean forgetting. It meant learning how to live with memory and carrying it forward in silence, strength, and survival. In Rwanda, some of the most tragic moments of the genocide happened in places they were meant to be sacred. Churches. For generations, churches have been places where people ran when danger came. A place where prayers meant protection. But in 1994, that belief was shattered. As violence spread, thousands of people gathered inside churches across the country. They believed the walls of worship would keep them safe. They prayed, they sang, they waited. But in many places, armed groups surrounded those same buildings. Doors that once symbolized refuge became points of entry for violence. Inside, people were trapped. There was nowhere to run, no escape routes, no protection, no fear. Some survivors later described moments where silence inside the church suddenly broke, followed by chaos inside. And then the realization that safety was gone. When the violence ended in these places, what remained was devastation. Not only loss of life, but loss of trust. Because if even a church could not protect people, then nowhere felt safe anymore. Today, many of those churches still stand, but they are no longer just places of worship. They are memorials, silent reminders of how far fear and hatred can go when a society collapses into violence. Among the most heartbreaking stories of the Rwanda genocide are the stories of children. Children who did not understand politics. Children who did not understand history. They only understood fear. In those 100 days, many children woke up in normal homes and ended the day in a completely different world. Some were separated from their parents in the chaos. Others lost entire families in a single moment. And many were forced to run alone, through roads filled with danger, through villages they no longer recognized. Some children hid in swamps for days. Some hid in forests. Some hid in ceilings, under beds, or inside abandoned buildings. They stayed silent for hours, sometimes days, hoping not to be found. Hunger became constant. Thirst became normal. And sleep came only in brief moments of exhaustion. Some children survived by staying completely still when danger passed. Others survived by pretending to be dead. But survival came at a cost. Because even when the violence stopped, the memory did not. After the genocide, Rwanda was left with thousands of orphans, children without parents, children without homes, children without anyone to explain what had happened. Some were taken in by distant relatives. Others grew up in overcrowded shelters. And many carried trauma that words could not fully describe. For them, childhood was interrupted and never truly returned in the same way. Yet, even in this generation of loss, life continued, slowly, painfully, but forward. As the killing spread across Rwanda, messages began reaching the outside world. Reports, warnings, desperate calls for help. But the response from the world was slow, too slow. On the ground, a small United Nations peacekeeping force was present in Rwanda. They were led by Commander Romeo Dallaire. He had received warnings before the genocide began. Warnings that armed militias were preparing large-scale violence. But those warnings were not acted upon with urgency. When the killing started, the peacekeepers quickly found themselves overwhelmed. They were not given enough troops, not given enough authority, and not given the political support needed to stop the violence. Instead of reinforcement, many international forces were withdrawn, leaving civilians even more exposed. In Rwanda, the scale of the violence was clear, but outside Rwanda, the world struggled to respond decisively. Some governments avoided using the word genocide because using that word would have required action, and action meant responsibility. So while the killing continued, diplomatic discussions continued too. Meetings were held, statements were issued, but on the ground, very little changed. For those trapped inside Rwanda, the message felt the same. Help was not coming fast enough, and time was running out. While Rwanda was burning from within, the outside world was watching from a distance. News reports showed fragments of the violence, images, headlines, but the full scale of what was happening was still difficult for many governments to accept or respond to quickly. Foreign embassies began evacuating their citizens. Airports became escape routes for foreign nationals. But for most Rwandans trapped inside the country, there was no evacuation, no safe passage, no international rescue plan large enough to match the speed of the violence. Some countries debated what was to call the crisis, whether it was civil war or mass killing, or something else entirely. But while the debate continued, people were dying every hour. Requests for stronger intervention moved slowly through international systems, approval processes, political hesitation, fear of becoming involved in another African conflict. Meanwhile, the violence inside Rwanda did not wait for approval. It spread faster than diplomacy could respond. In some moments, even small opportunities to stop or reduce the killing were missed because coordination between nations was weak. And urgency was not matched with action. For many survivors, this period remains one of the most painful memories, not only because of what happened inside Rwanda, but because of what did not happen outside Rwanda. Help was delayed, and for those inside the country, delay meant death. By the middle of 1994, Rwanda had been through months of unbearable violence. Entire communities had been destroyed, and millions of people were displaced, scattered across the country and beyond its borders. But the fighting did not continue in one direction forever. A military force known as Rwanda Patriotic Front was advancing from the north and east. They were fighting their way towards the capital, step by step, town by town, road by road. As they moved forward, the structure that had carried out much of the killing began to collapse. Government control weakened, many leaders fled, and chaos spread among those still carrying out violence. In July 1994, the Rwanda Patriotic Front entered Kigali. The capital had fallen, and with it, the machinery of the genocide came to a halt. The killing stopped, not because hatred had disappeared, but because the forces driving it were defeated. In the aftermath, silence returned to the streets, but it was not a peaceful silence. It was a heavy silence, a silence filled with absence and loss. For survivors, the end of the killing was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of another struggle to survive what was left behind. When the killing finally slowed, Rwanda did not immediately become still. It spilled outward, across borders, into neighboring countries, into camps that grew overnight. Millions of people fled their homes, not in orderly waves, but in desperate movements. Families walked for days. Some carried nothing. Some carried only the clothes on their backs. The road became crowded with exhausted people. Children crying from hunger, elderly people collapsing from fatigue, and everywhere uncertainty. In refugee camps, life was harsh, shelter was temporary, food was limited, diseases spread quickly, and survival became a daily struggle. Some camps were so large, they became temporary cities, but they were cities built on trauma. Inside them, people tried to find missing relatives, to build families that had been torn apart, to understand who had survived and who had not. At the same time, fear did not disappear at the borders. Many survivors still felt unsafe. because the memories of what had happened in Rwanda followed them. In some places, conflict and instability continued even beyond Rwanda's borders. What began as a national tragedy had now become a regional crisis. And for many displaced people, returning home did not feel like a simple journey back. It felt like stepping into an unknown future. When the violence finally ended, Rwanda was left in silence. But it was not the silence of peace, it was the silence of loss. Across the country, families began searching for what remained, searching for loved ones, searching for answers, searching for closure that often did not exist. The scale of death was difficult to fully comprehend. Entire communities had been erased. Names were missing from homes, schools, and churches. Bodies were buried in mass graves. Many were never identified. The number that emerged was staggering. In roughly 100 days, hundreds of thousands of people were killed. Some estimates reached even higher. But behind every number was a human life, a mother, a father, a child, a friend, a neighbor. Grief became a part of everyday life, and remembering became a duty. Because forgetting felt impossible, and forgetting felt dangerous. As Rwanda began to rebuild, one question remained at the center of everything. How do you bring justice after such a tragedy? How do you hold accountable those responsible for mass violence? And how do you begin again after so much has been lost? After the genocide, Rwanda faced the question that had no easy answer. How do you deliver justice after mass violence on such a scale? The courts could not handle the number of people involved quickly enough. The country was overwhelmed, so justice had to take many forms. At the national level, a tribunal was created to prosecute the key leaders and organizers of the genocide. Those believed to have planned, directed, or encouraged the killings. The process was slow, careful, and distant from villages where much of the violence had taken place. But it marked an important step, that the world recognized these crimes as something that required accountability. Inside Rwanda, another system was also developed, a community-based justice process where people who took part in the violence could confess, speak openly about what they did, and face judgment from their own communities. It was not perfect, it was painful, and often emotionally overwhelming for survivors, but it was an attempt to deal with truth on a massive scale, not only in courts, but in communities. At the same time, many high-level perpetrators were arrested. Some were imprisoned, others were tried over many years, and justice became a long process, not a single moment. For survivors, justice brought mixed feelings. Some found relief in seeing accountability begin. Others felt it could never truly match the scale of what was lost, because no court sentence could restore entire families. No verdict could return the dead. But justice still mattered, because it established something essential, that what happened in Rwanda was not acceptable, and that those responsible would not be forgotten. For those who survived the genocide, the end of violence did not mean the end of suffering, because survival came with memory, and memory does not disappear, it stays in silence, in dreams, in everyday life. Many survivors returned to communities that looked familiar but felt completely changed. Homes were gone, families were gone, entire parts of life had been erased. Some survivors were alone, completely alone. Others lived with relatives or strangers who became family through necessity. For many, speaking about what happened was difficult, sometimes impossible, because the memories were too heavy, too painful, too close. Yet, even in silence, the memories remained present. In sudden sounds, in crowded places, in moments of unexpected fear. Healing did not follow a straight path. Some days felt stronger than others. Some years felt heavier than others. But life continued, slowly, carefully, and often with great courage. Many survivors became voices of remembrance. They shared their stories so the world would not forget. Not to relieve the pain, but to ensure it was understood and never repeated. For them, memory became both a burden and a responsibility. Today, Rwanda is a country that carries two histories at the same time: the memory of what was lost and the effort to build what comes next. After the genocide, the nation faced a long and difficult rebuilding process. Entire systems had collapsed, communities had been destroyed, and trust had to be rebuilt from the ground up. In the years that followed, Rwanda focused heavily on national unity. The idea that people should no longer live divided by identity, but as one people, one country, one future. Cities began to grow again. Schools reopened and expanded. Hospitals were rebuilt. Roads were repaired. And slowly, daily life returned. In Kigali and other parts of the country, a new generation began to grow up who did not directly experience the genocide, but who still live in its shadow, because memory is still present in the landscape, in memorial sites, in annual remembrance days, in families that speak quietly about what was lost. Rwanda today is often described as one of the fastest developing countries in Africa, with growth in technology, infrastructure, and governance. But development exists alongside remembrance. Progress exists alongside grief. And rebuilding exists alongside memory. Because the past is not something Rwanda can erase. It is something it continues to carry forward with caution, reflection, and responsibility. Modern Rwanda is not defined only by what happened in 1994, but it is shaped by it. And in that shaping lies both its deepest pain and its determination never to return to that darkness again. Every story has an ending, but not every ending is the same as closure. For Rwanda, the genocide did not end with a single moment. It ended slowly, through survival, through justice, and through memory. But even today, the weight of what happened remains. Because justice is not only about punishment, it is about recognition, about truth, and about responsibility. The genocide in Rwanda was not an accident of history. It was the result of years of division, of fear that was repeated until it became belief, and of actions that were allowed to continue far too long. Many people ask how such a tragedy could happen. But Rwanda's story also asks another question. What happens when warning signs are ignored? When hate is normalized? When silence replaces intervention? The lessons are not only for Rwanda, they are for the world. Because genocide does not begin suddenly. It is built step by step, word by word, choice by choice. And it can only be stopped when people choose to see it clearly. Today, Rwanda remembers in memorials, in stories, in silence that carries meaning, and in a commitment to never return to what was lost. Justice cannot restore the lives that were taken, but it can speak their names through accountability and ensure that the world does not forget what happened here. Because remembering is not only about the past, it is a warning for the future, a responsibility carried by all of humanity. Rwanda remembers, and the world must remember with it. In the end, Rwanda is not only a story of loss, it is a story of what happens when humanity is tested to its breaking point, when fear is allowed to grow without challenge, when division becomes identity, and when silence replaces action. But it's also a story of survival, of people who lived through the unthinkable and still found a way to continue, not by forgetting, but by remembering and rebuilding. Justice came slowly, imperfectly, but it came. And it reminded the world that accountability matters. Because without it, truth fades. And without truth, there's no real healing. The lives lost in Rwanda were not statistics. They were human beings, with names, with families, with dreams that were never allowed to continue. To remember them is not only an act of history, it is an act of responsibility, so that what happened here is never repeated anywhere else. Not in Rwanda, not in any nation, not in any generation. Rwanda speaks to the world still, in its silence, in its memory, in its warning. And the question it leaves behind is simple. What will we choose to see before it is too late?